Imagine sitting at a royal banquet, surrounded by nobles and courtiers, when one bite of food could end your life. Every sip of wine, every morsel of bread, is a gamble, and the queen herself watches your fear like a predator. Tonight you will hear the story of Queen Isabeau, the woman who turned dinner parties into deadly games of power. Stay with me, and I promise, by the end of this feast, you'll never look at a royal smile the same way again. The shadow over the banquet hall. Every palace has its secrets, but some are carried not in dusty archives or locked chests, but in whispers passed nervously across candlelit tables. Queen Isabeau was a mistress of such whispers. Her reign was gilded, her court glittering, her gowns sewn with pearls and threaded with gold. Yet her reputation was not stitched from silk, but from fear. For the queen, it was said, did not merely host dinner parties, she poisoned them. No one could prove it. Chroniclers were careful, scribes wrote what they were paid to, and servants who knew too much often disappeared into silence. But the rumors clung, stubborn as ivy, ambassadors who collapsed before dessert, noble rivals who wasted away after a feast, courtiers who never rose from their final toast. Still, her invitations were coveted. To refuse was unthinkable. To attend was to stake one's life on a roll of invisible dice. Guests came draped in velvet, with charms sewn into their sleeves, with antidotes hidden in jeweled rings, with prayers muttered behind polite smiles. For though her banquets carried danger, they also carried power, and no one seeking influence dared stay away. Isabeau herself never looked more serene than at her table. She poured wine with her own hand, she pressed morsels onto plates, she laughed softly when a toast was raised. Watching her, one could almost forget the dread that hovered over the feast. Almost. What made her more dangerous still was the uncertainty. Had she truly learned the art of poisons from apothecaries and monks, mastering nightshade, henbane, and wolfsbane as though they were spices? Or was her venom nothing more than rumor, a phantom stronger than arsenic, spread from tongue to tongue until it rotted courage from within? The answer, perhaps, mattered less than the fear she inspired. For fear itself was a poison, and in Queen Isabeau's court, it was poured as generously as wine. And so the legend begins, with a dinner party so elaborate, so perilous, that it would be remembered long after the last candle burned out. The invitations. It began with parchment and wax. The queen's scribes, bent over their desks by lamplight, scratched names in ink onto scrolls edged in gold. Each bore the royal seal, a rampant lion pressed deep into scarlet wax. The messengers chosen to carry them were dressed not in armor but in silken livery, for these were not summons to war but to something far more dangerous, a dinner table. By dawn, riders were already galloping out from the palace gates, ribbons streaming behind them. They delivered the scrolls to the city's great houses, where servants rushed to awaken their masters with trembling hands. To dine with Her Majesty, the scrolls declared, on the feast of St. Urban, at the palace hall. For the nobles of the realm, the message was both a gift and a threat. To be invited was to be seen, to be included in the queen's orbit of favor. But behind the courtesies lay the shadow every courtier knew too well. Many had feasted at her table and risen no more. Preparations began at once. In every chamber of every great house, velvet gowns were brushed with lavender water, rings polished, cloaks scented with rosemary. Some nobles slipped charms into their sleeves, tiny crosses, dried herbs, even bezoar stones said to guard against poison. Apothecaries did brisk trade in powders that promised protection, though whether they cured or killed was anyone's guess. The city buzzed with speculation. Merchants whispered as they stacked figs and almonds, wondering which dishes would grace the queen's table this year. The butchers prayed their cuts might be chosen, for coin flowed freely when the palace kitchens called. And in the taverns, where ale loosened tongues, men muttered about who might not return from the feast. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Queen Isabeau prepared her stage. She ordered spices from distant lands, pepper from Venice, cinnamon from Alexandria, saffron from Iberia. She instructed her cooks to glaze pheasants with honey, to drown fish in sauces so fragrant they masked any other taste. And in her private chamber, she opened a chest no servant dared touch. Inside lay a collection of vials no larger than a child's thumb. Some held powders white as sugar, others liquids darker than wine. She touched them with a strange tenderness, like a musician tuning her strings. "Tonight," she murmured, fastening her emerald necklace, "the kingdom will feast. And it will remember." The arrival of the guests. The palace glowed like a lantern against the night. Torches flared along its battlements, and the windows of the great hall spilled golden light into the darkened streets. Carriages rattled up the cobbled road, horses snorting clouds into the chill air. One by one, the nobles of the realm emerged, cloaked in velvet and fur, their jewels flashing like stars under the torchlight. They smiled, bowed, and murmured pleasantries, but beneath the polish ran an undercurrent of dread. Every step toward the great doors was a wager. Every nod to a fellow guest was weighed with suspicion. For all knew that in Queen Isabeau's hall, friendship and rivalry could share a table, and poison did not discriminate. Inside, the hall was a theater of opulence. Chandeliers dripped with wax, casting light upon long tables groaning with delicacies. Swans roasted whole gleamed with golden skin. Trays of candied fruits sparkled like jewels. Platters of spiced fish, fragrant pies, and steaming breads filled the air with a perfume rich enough to smother thought. Minstrels plucked soft notes, a music meant to soothe the nerves of trembling hands. The guests took their places according to rank. The high nobles clustered nearest the queen's chair, while lesser lords and ladies arranged themselves further down the board. Servants glided between them like shadows, filling goblets with wine so dark it might have been ink. And then she entered. Queen Isabeau swept into the hall in a gown of deep emerald, embroidered with golden ivy that seemed to climb her body as if she herself were a living tree. A crown of pearls glimmered upon her brow, though her true power was in her eyes, calm, calculating, and watchful. She smiled as though she alone knew the ending of the play about to unfold. The guests rose to greet her, bowing low. She inclined her head graciously, her fingers brushing the jeweled vial that hung from her neck like an ornament. Few noticed it, yet those who did shivered. "Be seated," she said, her voice clear and warm, carrying to every corner of the hall. "Tonight we celebrate not only Saint Urban, but the unity of our kingdom. May friendship guide our cups, and loyalty flavor our bread." A cheer rose, polite but thin. Chairs scraped against stone as the company obeyed. Yet even as the first dishes were laid before them, the fear clung. Hands trembled as goblets were lifted. Eyes flicked toward the queen's plate. Did she eat before the others, or after? Was her cup filled from the same pitcher as theirs? And so the feast began, every bite as perilous as it was delicious. The servants moved with the precision of dancers, refilling goblets and placing silver bowls brimming with olives, almonds, and figs along the length of the table. Candles hissed as their wax ran, shadows flickering across jeweled collars and gilded buttons. At the queen's right hand sat Duke Raoul, a man whose beard was as silver as his armor. He lifted his goblet high, his voice carrying with the ease of long command. "To Her Majesty," he declared, "who keeps our kingdom prosperous and our enemies wary. May her reign be as enduring as her grace." A murmur of assent rose, though some voices cracked slightly under the weight of their own hesitation. The nobles drank, each one watching the others out of the corners of their eyes. Raoul swallowed deeply, and for a brief, breathless moment the hall seemed to hold still. Then he smiled, lowered his cup, and wiped his mustache with the back of his hand. Relief fluttered down the tables like a sigh of wind. The queen inclined her head, her lips curved in the faintest smile. "Your loyalty warms me, my lord." A countess further down, pale beneath her rouge, raised her own goblet next. "To peace," she called, her voice trembling. "May our tables remain filled, and our children sleep safely." Again the nobles drank. Again, eyes darted toward their neighbors. A young baron coughed mid-swallow, and several hands froze on their cups until his laughter broke the tension. Still, the air thickened. Each toast was not merely a formality. It was a test of courage, an act of trust in the unseen. The queen alone seemed utterly at ease. She ate delicately, plucking morsels of roasted pheasant with jeweled fingers, sipping wine as though it were no more dangerous than spring water. Her calm unnerved more than any threat could have. Then she lifted her own cup. Conversation faltered, even the minstrels stilled their strings. "To my beloved guests," Queen Isabeau said, her voice rich and measured, "who honor me with their presence tonight. May this hall be remembered not for fear, but for fellowship. Drink, and know that you are treasured." Her eyes lingered on each face, her smile unfaltering, as though daring any to defy her. The nobles raised their cups in unison, the clink of silver and gold echoing like the tolling of bells. They drank, their throats tight, the taste of honeyed wine almost bitter on their tongues. And beneath the glow of the chandeliers, the game had truly begun. The first ripple. The feast unfolded with pageantry, platters of roasted swan, its feathers gilded and reattached for display, pies whose crusts concealed quail and pheasant, trenchers of bread heavy with butter and garlic. Servants moved in quiet precision, setting dish after dish before the glittering assembly. For a time, laughter rang out, though always too loud, as though each voice sought to banish unease. Goblets were raised, stories told of hunting parties and courtly scandals, and the minstrels resumed their playing. Yet beneath the noise, the fear remained like a low drumbeat. It began subtly. A knight near the middle of the hall paused with a forkful of fish halfway to his lips. He frowned, shook his head, and set the fork down. Perhaps he disliked the flavor, or perhaps his stomach rebelled from too much wine, but those nearest him noticed. Their eyes darted to his plate, then back to their own. Moments later, a lady coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed too loudly in the hush that followed. Her husband patted her back, murmuring about dust in the air. She smiled weakly, lifted her goblet to prove her health, and drank deep. But the silence that lingered after her swallow was long, heavy, and sharp. A ripple moved down the table. Guests shifted in their seats, some pushing food about their plates rather than eating. Others pressed napkins to their mouths after every bite, as though wiping away more than crumbs. The older nobles, those who had survived many of Isabeau's feasts, chewed slowly, cautiously, eyes never leaving the queen. Isabeau herself noticed, of course. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, her gaze calm and unreadable. Then she reached for the very dish the knight had abandoned, took a portion onto her own plate, and ate it with delicate grace. The effect was immediate. Conversations restarted, goblets lifted once more, and the tension eased, but only slightly. For if the queen had tasted the dish and lived, then why had the knight refused it? And if she ate without fear, did it mean she was innocent, or simply immune to her own recipes? The air thickened again, heavier than the smoke from the torches. The nobles feasted, yes, but every swallow felt like a gamble. And somewhere, unnoticed amid the glitter and music, a young servant carrying a tray of goblets glanced nervously toward the queen, as though he knew something the rest did not. A stain on the tablecloth. The servant with the tray of goblets wove through the crowd, his hands trembling just enough that the wine rippled against the rims. He set one before Duke Raoul, another before the countess, then paused at the queen's side. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. His gaze was wide, fearful, but hers was steady as a still pond. She inclined her head slightly, and he placed her goblet down with both hands, retreating as quickly as courtesy allowed. Not long after, the first true sign came. A young baron at the lower end of the table had been laughing, too loudly, as though determined to banish dread by sheer force of cheer. He raised his cup high in mid-story, but before he could finish his toast, his voice cut short. His hand shook violently, red wine spilling across the white linen like blood. Gasps rose. The baron stumbled back from the bench, clutching his stomach. His goblet rolled across the floor, clanging against stone. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then his squire rushed forward, helping him to a chair. The baron's face had gone pale, his lips the color of ash. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks hovered, suspended. The minstrels faltered, strings ringing discord. Every eye turned, first to the baron, then, inevitably, to Queen Isabeau. She remained composed, her hand resting lightly on the stem of her goblet. Her voice, when it came, was cool and measured. "Perhaps too much wine," she said, "or too little bread." Her calmness unsettled more than panic could have. The courtiers whispered, shifting uneasily. A few pushed their plates aside entirely. The baron retched once, violently, staining his embroidered doublet. The squire called for a physician, though none dared move quickly, as though haste might reveal suspicion. The queen merely sipped her wine, untroubled. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she signaled for the minstrels to resume their song. And so, beneath the notes of lutes and viols, the first shadow of undeniable danger spread across the hall, like a stain that could not be washed from the cloth. Whispers in the candlelight. The baron's moans had faded to a soft, pitiful sound, like a wounded animal. His squire fanned him with a napkin, while a servant brought a bowl that he promptly filled. The scent turned the stomachs of nearby guests, and many pushed back from the table entirely. Still, Queen Isabeau dined. She tore a morsel of pheasant from its bone with deliberate grace, chewed, swallowed, and dabbed her lips with the cloth. Her composure was unnerving. The whispers began at once, darting from mouth to ear like quicksilver. "Too much wine, perhaps." "No, I saw him eat the same fish." "But only after she did you see? She tasted it first." "Then how is she untouched?" The murmurs grew, though none dared raise their voices too high. Suspicion seemed to dart in every direction. Some nobles eyed their neighbors, wondering if rivals had tampered with the platters. Others glanced at the queen's untouched dishes, wondering if she had chosen carefully which foods to sample. The countess, who had earlier coughed, now placed her napkin firmly over her plate and folded her hands as though in prayer. "I believe I have eaten enough for one evening," she whispered to her husband, though the tremor in her voice carried to others. They, too, set aside their food. A knight shifted uneasily and muttered, "If one man falls, who is next?" His hand gripped the hilt of his dagger, as though steel might guard against poison. The queen's gaze swept the table. She smiled, faint but clear, her jeweled rings glittering in the candlelight as she raised her goblet once more. "My lords and ladies," she said, her voice silken, "is it not strange that joy can sour so swiftly? We gathered to celebrate, yet one upset stomach and you would think yourselves at war with shadows." Her eyes lingered, just long enough to suggest she heard every whisper. "And shadows, my friends," she continued, "cannot harm you. Unless, of course, you invite them in." A murmur rippled across the hall. Some nobles shifted uncomfortably, others bowed their heads, but all returned their attention to their goblets and plates. No one dared leave. To rise now would mark them as cowards, or worse, guilty of mistrust. The queen had trapped them with a smile, and the whispers fell back into silence. But beneath that silence, fear still gnawed. The second victim. The hall's heavy air seemed to thicken as the night dragged forward. Though the minstrels plucked dutifully at their strings and servants carried in fresh platters, the merriment had soured beyond saving. Conversation dwindled into clipped phrases, laughter rang false, and every guest measured each bite as though it might be their last. Then it happened again. The countess who had sworn off food earlier dabbed her lips with her napkin and made to rise. Her husband reached to steady her, yet before she could take a step, her knees buckled. She collapsed against him with a soft cry. A goblet toppled from the table, spilling its contents across the rushes. The hall froze. Her face had gone pale as marble, her lips tinged blue. She clutched her throat, gasping for air that would not come. The knight beside her leapt up, shouting for aid, while her husband shouted prayers, his hands trembling as he tried to lift her head. A dozen courtiers stared wide-eyed, half rising from their benches before sitting again, as though unsure whether flight or stillness offered more safety. The queen alone did not stir. Her gaze followed the scene with cool detachment, as though watching a play unfold. Then she set down her fork with a soft click against porcelain. "Bring water," she said simply. But the water arrived too late. The countess convulsed once, then stilled. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint scraping of a chair as someone backed away from the table. Now there was no mistaking it. No excuse of too much wine, no claim of weak stomach. Death had visited the table openly, and it had chosen its victim at random. Fear tore through the hall like fire through dry straw. Voices rose, frantic whispers becoming panicked cries. Some nobles shoved their plates aside with clattering force, others clutched their goblets as though frozen, unable to drink yet unwilling to set them down. And through it all, Queen Isabeau sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. When the noise grew too loud, she lifted one hand, and the hall fell into uneasy silence once more. Her words came slowly, with a weight that pressed upon every ear. "Eat," she said, "or do not. But remember this, none leave my table until the feast is done." Gilded prisoners. The queen's command hung in the air like a chain. "None leave my table until the feast is done." The nobles shifted uneasily, trapped by custom as much as by her words. To disobey the sovereign in her own hall was unthinkable, yet to remain seated, to lift another morsel of food or sip of wine, felt like stepping blindly into the grave. The doors at the far end of the chamber loomed, tall and heavy, guarded by 2 soldiers in polished mail. Their halberds gleamed in the torchlight. No one doubted that the queen's order would be enforced if tested. The guests were not merely her companions tonight, they were captives dressed in silk and jewels. At the lower end of the table, a young viscount whispered fiercely to his neighbor. "It is treachery. She means to thin us out, to rid herself of rivals." His neighbor hissed back. "Lower your voice, fool, unless you wish to be next." Others began bargaining silently with fate, pushing food toward their neighbors, refusing refills, tracing the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. Some gnawed at bread alone, convinced it was safest. A few drank deeply in grim defiance, daring death to claim them quickly rather than through the slow drip of fear. And above it all, Queen Isabeau presided like a goddess at sacrifice. She spoke little, merely smiling when her eyes met those of her terrified subjects. When servants entered bearing fresh dishes, she gestured for them to set the platters down, untouched, as though the very abundance mocked the starving courage of her guests. Duke Raoul, ever the boldest, slammed his fist upon the table, rattling goblets. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber, "this is madness. Men and women lie stricken, and yet you command we sit idle? What answer shall I give when my knights ask why I returned from your table while my peers did not?" The queen regarded him calmly. Then she raised her own goblet, drank slowly, and set it down without a tremor. "Tell them," she said, "that their duke was wise enough to finish his supper." The hall erupted with whispers once more. The nobles were learning, obedience bought survival, if only for another hour. Rivals at the table. Fear does strange things to noble blood. What began as shared unease soon curdled into suspicion. The Viscount who had whispered of treachery now eyed his neighbor's untouched goblet. "Why do you not drink?" he demanded under his breath, his voice taut with accusation. "Do you know something the rest of us do not?" The neighbor bristled, replying too loudly. "I have no thirst. Must I prove my loyalty with every swallow?" His goblet clattered as he raised it, drinking defiantly. The sound of his gulps echoed across the hall, and when he slammed the cup down, several guests startled as though struck. On the opposite side of the table, two barons argued over a trencher of bread. One insisted the other take the first piece. The other refused, pressing it back. The gesture, meant as courtesy, grew into a struggle of wills, hands shoving, eyes glaring. At last the bread fell to the rushes below, uneaten, and both men sat back with clenched jaws, their rivalry stoked anew. Even husbands and wives turned wary. A lady accused her spouse of urging her to eat too eagerly. He swore by heaven he only wished her strength. She pulled her plate toward her chest as though shielding it from him. The hall had become a gallery of mistrust, every glance sharpened into a dagger. Through it all, Queen Isabeau reclined, serene amid the growing storm. She observed their quarrels with the faintest tilt of her head, like a scholar watching the progress of an experiment. Duke Raoul, still bold, attempted to restore order. He stood, his great frame looming over the table. "We dishonor ourselves," he thundered. "Will we be remembered as squabbling children, or as lords and ladies of the realm? We are not prisoners, we are guests." The last word faltered as he looked to the queen, whose smile never wavered. "Guests," she echoed softly, her tone a caress and a warning at once. "And guests, my lord Duke, know better than to abandon their hostess mid-course." Her words silenced the chamber. Raoul sat slowly, his jaw tight. The nobles resumed their feasting, or rather, their pretense of it. They moved morsels about their plates, lifted goblets to lips without drinking, chewed bread until it turned to paste. But the unity of the hall had splintered. They were no longer one court, bound by loyalty and kinship. They were rivals in survival, each watching the other with the desperation of trapped animals. And the queen's eyes gleamed as the cracks spread. Accusations at midnight. The candles had burned low, their wax pooling in molten rivers across the polished silver stands. Smoke curled in the rafters, thickening the already stifling air. By now the feast had lost all semblance of celebration. Plates sat cooling, goblets stood half full, and every word at the table came edged with suspicion. It began with a lady of sharp tongue and sharper jewels. Rising from her seat, she pointed a jeweled finger at the knight who had refused his fish earlier in the night. "You!" she cried. "You knew not to eat. You watched as others did, and yet you pushed your plate aside. Did you place the poison there yourself?" The knight surged to his feet, outraged. "Lies! Would I be fool enough to strike at my queen in her own hall? I merely mistrusted the smell of the dish." "Mistrusted, or recognized?" the lady pressed, her voice quivering with fear as much as anger. The hall erupted. Voices shouted over one another, accusations, denials, protests of loyalty. A baron swore that the servants were in league with enemies across the border. A merchant noble declared the goblets themselves must be tainted. Another insisted the queen had arranged it all to punish them for whispers at court. Chairs scraped. Hands found the hilts of daggers. The long table that once bound them together now felt like a battlefield line. Queen Isabeau let the clamor build until it shook the rafters. Then, with a single clap of her hands, she summoned silence. "Enough," she said, her voice ringing through the smoke. "You dishonor my hall with your squabbling. Look to yourselves before casting blame." She rose, her figure tall and commanding in the glow of the chandeliers. Her goblet, untouched since the Countess's collapse, gleamed in her hand. "You ask who has poisoned this feast," she said, her eyes sweeping the assembly. "I tell you this, poison lives in every one of you. In your envy. In your greed. In the lies you whisper in corners when you think your queen cannot hear. Tonight you taste not my malice, but your own." The hall fell silent, cowed by her words. Even Duke Raoul, his fists clenched, could not summon a reply. Then, slowly, deliberately, the queen raised her goblet. Every eye fixed upon her. She drank deeply, draining the wine in one swallow. When she lowered the cup, she smiled. And still she stood. Death returns to the table. For a moment after the queen drank, the hall seemed suspended in a spell. Every noble leaned forward, eyes locked upon her, waiting for a tremor, a cough, the smallest falter in her poise. But Queen Isabeau remained still, her face calm as a painted icon. The silence stretched. A single log cracked in the hearth, startling more than one guest. Then whispers began anew, hushed and desperate. "She drinks as though untouchable. Perhaps she has her own cup, untouched by servants. Or she has taken antidotes, long in secret." The speculation swelled, yet no one dared voice it loudly. The queen had proven her strength, and in doing so, made their fear appear weak, cowardly, pitiful. But fear is not so easily banished. At the far end of the table, a merchant lord leaned forward, his hand trembling upon the wood. His eyes rolled, his lips murmured a prayer that never finished. Then, with a guttural sound, he collapsed face first into his platter. Wine spilled from his goblet, mingling with the juices of roasted goose, running like blood across the cloth. This time, no one rushed to his aid. Chairs scraped as nobles shoved themselves away from the body, some leaping to their feet, others clutching their throats, as though they too might fall. The stench of vomit and spilt wine filled the chamber. The merchant lord twitched once, then lay still, his hands still clutching a crust of bread. Panic roared through the hall. Men shouted for their guards. Women clutched rosaries, sobbing into their sleeves. One baron attempted to flee, only to be halted by the crossed halberds of the queen's soldiers at the door. The clang of steel silenced him more effectively than any words. Queen Isabeau regarded the corpse with cool detachment. Then she turned to her guests, her voice soft but carrying. "You see," she said, "how fragile life is when laced with doubt. You curse my table, yet your own fear is the stronger poison." Her gaze swept across them all, glittering, unyielding. "Sit. Eat. Drink. You will not leave until dawn. Let us see by then, who among you endures." A shiver passed down the table like wine through dead leaves. The nobles sank back into their chairs, trembling, trapped between hunger, terror, and the queen's will. And the feast of shadows dragged deeper into the night. Blame falls on the servants. The hall had grown thick with the scent of fear, sweat beneath silks, wine gone sour, meat cooling on abandoned platters. Candles guttered in their pools of wax, casting long, quivering shadows across faces drawn tight with dread. It was then that suspicion, once aimed sideways among nobles, tilted downward. A baron, his hands trembling so fiercely he could scarcely lift his goblet, slammed it down with sudden fury. "It is the servants," he barked. "They carry the platters. They pour the wine. Who else has touched every morsel upon this table?" Others seized upon his words like drowning men upon driftwood. The boy with the tray, he lingered too long by the queen. The girl with the bread, she slipped a hand beneath the cloth. They are spies, tools of her will, or worse, her masters in disguise. The servants froze, eyes wide, trays shaking in their hands. One young maid dropped a dish, the crash of porcelain ringing like a cry for mercy. She sank to her knees, pleading, but her voice was drowned beneath the noble's rising roar. Duke Raoul stood, towering, his face grim. "You would tear apart children for the comfort of your cowardice?" he thundered. Yet his words were met with glares, not agreement. Fear had warped his peers into something crueler, sharper, more dangerous than any blade. One knight seized a trembling servant by the arm, dragging him forward to the queen's dais. "Tell us," he demanded. "Confess what was slipped into our wine. Speak, and perhaps you will be spared." The boy sobbed, shaking his head. "I know nothing, my lords, I swear it on my soul." Queen Isabeau raised a hand. The knight froze, caught in the weight of her gaze. "Release him," she commanded, her voice low but iron-bound. Reluctantly, the knight obeyed, shoving the servant aside. The boy fled to the shadows, clutching his arm. The queen's smile returned, thin as the edge of a blade. "How quick you are to condemn the lowest at your table! Perhaps that is why you fear me so, that I remind you you are not untouchable. That you, too, may be unseated." Her words slashed deeper than any accusation. The nobles shrank back, chastened yet unrepentant. They knew the truth. They were not only prisoners, but pawns. And as the night wore on, the pawns grew restless. The edge of madness. The night deepened until the hall seemed suspended outside of time. The windows showed only blackness, the moon long hidden behind clouds. The torches hissed low, their smoke mingling with the stale air of uneaten food and sour wine. Hunger gnawed at the nobles, but fear bound their hands. Platters of roasted venison and sugared fruits lay untouched, congealed fat glistening in the candlelight. Some guests stared at their plates for so long that the shapes began to shift, pheasant bones twisting into skeletal fingers, figs blooming with imagined worms. A lady laughed suddenly, high, shrill, and utterly without reason. "Do you not see?" she cried, gesturing to her trencher. "The bread smiles at me." She tore it apart, stuffing pieces into her mouth until crumbs sprayed across her gown. Her husband tried to restrain her, but she shrieked like a wild creature, eyes glazed with terror. Others fared no better. A baron clutched his goblet to his chest as though it were holy relic, muttering prayers into its rim. Another stared fixedly at the queen, whispering to himself, "She does not blink, she does not blink," until his voice cracked. The minstrels, long silent, huddled in a corner, their instruments forgotten. One plucked a single trembling note, only to stop when the queen's gaze fell upon him. The silence that followed was worse than any song. Even Duke Raoul, who had stood tall through the night, now sagged against the table, his hands buried in his hair. "This is no feast," he murmured hoarsely. "This is purgatory." Through it all, Queen Isabeau sat composed, her back straight, her smile faint but unyielding. She had not faltered, not yawned, not so much as shifted in her chair. It was as though the night obeyed her, stretching endlessly to test the limits of her guest's sanity. One nobleman broke suddenly, lunging toward the doors. "Enough! I will not die in here like a rat in a trap!" he shouted. The guards crossed their halberds, steel clanging with finality. He stumbled back, his face pale, and sank to his knees in despair. The queen raised her goblet once more, its surface catching the weak glow of candlelight. "Drink," she whispered, her words silk in the silence. "For dawn is still far away." The pale light of dawn. At last, After a night that felt endless, a faint light crept through the tall windows. The gray of dawn spread cautiously across the hall, brushing pale faces, revealing what darkness had hidden. The sight was grim. Some nobles slumped against the table, their goblets spilled, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Others lay stretched upon the floor, still breathing but insensible, their fine clothes stained with wine and sweat. A handful had not moved in hours, their bodies rigid, their lips blue, their plates before them like mock gravestones. The survivors looked more like beggars than lords. Jewels hung crooked, gowns torn, hair matted to damp brows. Their voices were hoarse, their hands shaking from hunger, exhaustion, and dread. They dared not look at one another, for each gaze carried the memory of panic and accusation. And at the head of the table, radiant in the pale light, sat Queen Isabeau. Her gown was unwrinkled, her crown steady, her eyes bright. She looked as though she had slept soundly through the night, rather than presided over its horrors. She rose slowly, the sound of her chair scraping the stone floor sending a shiver down weary spines. "My friends," she said, her voice low yet piercing, "you have endured. You have feasted not on flesh and wine, but on truth." No one answered. Only the creak of benches and the faint sob of a woman who had lost her husband broke the silence. The Queen's gaze swept across them, resting briefly on each bowed head. "Now you know what it is to sit beneath the weight of suspicion. To feel your life balanced upon the kindness, or malice, of another. Remember this night. Remember who stood steadfast, and who faltered." She descended the dais, her steps unhurried, passing between the battered survivors as though walking through a battlefield after victory. Servants, pale but obedient, moved to clear the bodies from the floor, laying sheets across the fallen. At the doors, the Queen paused. Morning light caught the edge of her smile. "You may go," she said. "But go knowing this: I have no need of poison to master you. Your fear is feast enough." The great doors opened, and the survivors stumbled into the chill dawn. Behind them, the Queen's hall lay heavy with the memory of whispers, screams, and the unshakable silence of the dead. The kingdom whispers. By mid-morning, word had already spilled from the castle like wine from an overturned cup. Servants, guards, and trembling courtiers carried scraps of the tale into the markets, taverns, and churches of the city. The story grew with every retelling. Some swore the Queen had poisoned every dish, testing antidotes on her own body before she dined. Others claimed she had whispered a spell into the wine, binding the nobles' tongues and driving them mad. A few said the torches themselves had smoked with venom, filling the air with a miasma of death. Merchants set down their scales to argue whether the Duke had survived. Housewives shushed children in the streets, muttering that the Queen's gaze could wither a man's heart. Priests preached hurried sermons, warning that sin had invited such horrors into the realm. Fear became the Queen's herald, carrying her name farther than banners ever could. In the castle, survivors withdrew into themselves. Some refused food for days, terrified that every bite concealed poison. Others fell ill from their own dread, stomachs clenching at the memory of untouched platters and the Queen's command to drink. Duke Raoul, once bold, now kept his chamber locked, answering knocks with a trembling voice. Lady Isabel, who had laughed at the bread, slipped into a melancholy so deep her maids whispered she no longer knew day from night. The Queen, however, appeared in public stronger than ever. She held court in the gardens, sunlight gleaming off her crown, her smile serene. She dined openly before ambassadors, consuming grapes and roasted lamb with no hint of fear. Every gesture declared her unassailable. And yet not all bowed to her newfound aura. In the dark corners of the kingdom, whispers took a sharper edge. If the Queen could command life and death at a feast, what would stop her from doing so in war? If she could turn nobles into trembling husks, what hope remained for common folk? Beneath the hush of all, suspicion rooted itself. Her legend grew, yes, but legends can breed enemies as swiftly as followers. And still, Isabeau smiled. For she knew, a crown shines brightest when it is rimmed with fear. The envoy's challenge. The Queen's legend had grown so swiftly that it reached even the ears of her enemies. From across the mountains rode an envoy, Lord Alaric of Vaimont, a man known for his blunt tongue and disdain for courtly games. He arrived not with velvet retinues, but with a lean company of armored riders, their banners plain, their faces hard. They entered the castle courtyard with no music, no flourish, as though they came not for diplomacy but for judgment. The Queen received him in the great hall, the very chamber where the Feast of Dread had taken place. The tables had been cleared, the tapestries replaced, and flowers set in silver vases. Yet the air still carried a heaviness, as though the stones themselves remembered the screams of the night. Lord Alaric bowed only slightly. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice low but steady, "I come not to flatter, but to see with my own eyes whether the tales are true." Isabeau's lips curved. "And what tales reach your ears, my lord?" "That you are no queen, but a witch. That you feast on fear. That your own lords tremble more at your smile than at an army's charge." His gaze swept the room, then fixed upon her again. "I come to ask whether you rule with justice, or with poison." Gasps fluttered among the courtiers, but the Queen raised a hand for silence. She stepped forward, her gown whispering against the stone floor. "You are bold, Lord Alaric," she said. "Bold enough to enter my hall and question my crown. Tell me, do you expect to leave this place alive?" His jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "If your power is truth, then yes. For truth needs no cloak of terror." The Queen studied him, her eyes gleaming with something colder than anger, something closer to delight. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we should dine together. You and I. No lords, no frightened nobles. Just a queen, and a man who doubts her." The hall rippled with unease. Servants exchanged fearful glances, and a murmur rose like wind before a storm. Lord Alaric inclined his head. "So be it." The Queen clapped her hands. At once, the doors swung wide, and platters of food were borne in, steaming meats, jeweled fruits, pitchers of wine. The scent filled the hall, rich and intoxicating, though all knew it could mask a darker perfume. The stage was set. The duel of the table. The table was long, yet the Queen and Lord Alaric sat opposite each other as though upon a dueling ground. The courtiers lined the walls, silent as statues, watching with wide, anxious eyes. No one else dared to touch a morsel. The first dish was brought forward, a roasted pheasant, its skin lacquered to a golden crisp, its claws curled as if in final protest. The Queen carved it herself, the knife sliding cleanly through the breast. She placed a portion upon Alaric's plate, then upon her own. "Eat," she said, her smile as bright as the silver blade. Without hesitation, Alaric raised his fork. He chewed slowly, deliberately, and swallowed. His gaze never left hers. "Delicious," he said. The Queen mirrored him, taking her own bite. The room seemed to exhale as she swallowed. Next came goblets of red wine, dark as garnet. The Queen poured both cups with her own hand. She lifted hers first, letting the liquid glisten in the light. "To courage," she said. "To truth," Alaric countered. They drank together. So the meal unfolded, course after course, bite for bite, sip for sip. Each gesture was a move upon an invisible chessboard. When the Queen reached for figs, Alaric reached for figs. When she dipped bread into spiced sauce, he mirrored her, his hand steady though his men at the walls shifted uneasily. but the true duel was in their words. "You speak plainly, Lord Alaric," the Queen said at last, her tone light as honey. "Few men dare such honesty in my hall. Tell me, do your people admire you for it, or curse you?" "They admire truth more than honeyed lies," he replied, spearing a pear with his knife. "Even when truth cuts deep. And yet," she said, sipping delicately from her cup, "truth has many shapes. Some say I am a witch. Others say I am the savior of this realm, too cunning to be overthrown. Which truth shall I choose, I wonder?" Alaric leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Choose neither. A queen who must terrify her people is no queen at all. But one who earns their loyalty needs no poison." The hall froze. For a heartbeat, it seemed his words might summon wrath, that the Queen's smile might sharpen into cruelty. But Isabeau only laughed, soft, silvery, unsettling. "You are brave indeed. Brave enough to insult me over my own table." She set down her goblet, her eyes glinting like a blade drawn in moonlight. "Very well, Lord Alaric. Let us see if your truth can outlast my patience." The meal was not yet done. Breaking the silence, the hall seemed to breathe with them, each fork raised, each goblet tilted, each pause between bites magnified until silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. The courtiers dared not shift their weight, for fear it might draw the Queen's eye. At last came the final course, a silver platter of sugared almonds, glistening white as pearls. They were placed between Queen and envoy, delicate as snowflakes, harmless in appearance yet heavy with dread. The Queen lifted one between her fingers, holding it to the light. "A sweet ending," she murmured, "or a bitter one?" She placed it upon her tongue, chewing slowly, her smile unbroken. Lord Alaric mirrored her, crunching down upon the sugared shell. The sound cracked through the hall like a pistol shot. He swallowed, his eyes unwavering. "Neither," he said. "Merely an almond." For the first time, something flickered across the Queen's face. Was it amusement, or annoyance? No one could tell. Then, Alaric pushed back his chair. The scrape echoed like thunder. He stood, tall and broad, and turned so all could hear. "I have eaten her meat. I have drunk her wine. I have shared her bread. And still I live." His voice rang with iron certainty. "This Queen does not command death at a whim, she commands fear. And fear is only as strong as those who bow to it." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some nobles lowered their eyes in shame, others stiffened in outrage. The courtiers held their breath, waiting for the Queen's wrath to strike like a storm. But Queen Isabeau only rose with quiet grace. She crossed the distance between them, her gown whispering along the stones, until she stood before Alaric. For a moment their faces were a breath apart. "You think you have won, my lord?" she whispered, so soft that only those nearest could hear. "Then you have not understood the game." Her smile spread, radiant and terrible, as she turned to the watching crowd. "Behold," she declared, her voice carrying to the rafters, "a man who dares eat at my table and live. A man unbroken by fear." Murmurs surged through the hall, confusion mixing with awe. Was this praise or condemnation? No one knew. But one truth was clear: the duel was not yet ended. The Queen's last move. The hall waited, hearts caught between dread and hope. The Queen stood beside Lord Alaric, her presence eclipsing his defiance like the sun swallowing a star. "See him," she said, her voice carrying with effortless command. "He dined without trembling. He faced me without faltering. He is proof that my throne does not rest on poison or spellcraft, but on the strength of those who dare stand upright in my presence." She turned to Alaric, eyes gleaming. "And for that, Lord of Vaimont, I name you ally. Not enemy." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Some gaped, expecting her to order his death. Others bowed their heads in relief, grateful that no more blood would stain the hall. Yet in the hearts of many, unease deepened. For what did it mean if the queen could twist even defiance into her own triumph? Alaric's jaw tightened. He had survived her feast, survived her gaze, and yet he felt as though he had walked willingly into her snare. To kill him would have made him a martyr. To spare him, and crown his defiance as proof of her power, made him a tool of her legend. He bowed, stiff and wary. "As you will, your majesty." The queen smiled, her triumph complete. "So it is settled. This kingdom is not ruled by fear, but by strength. Let every tale of this hall carry that truth." The courtiers bent low, some in reverence, others in submission. The hall filled with the sound of scraping benches and murmured praises. Yet behind every bowed head lurked the same question: had they witnessed mercy, or mastery? As the queen withdrew to her dais, dawn's full light poured through the windows, flooding the hall in gold. It seemed to crown her anew, the sovereign who had turned poison into legend, dread into loyalty. And thus her story spread far beyond the castle walls. In every tavern, peasants whispered of the queen who had tested her nobles with poisoned feasts. In every court, lords weighed her smile with terror. And in every prayer, priests warned of the woman who ruled not by God's grace, but by the alchemy of fear. But Isabeau herself cared little for whispers. She had shown the world what mattered most, that in her kingdom, even truth could be made to kneel. And so the queen who poisoned dinner parties reigned on, her legend sealed not by the death of her enemies, but by the captivity of their hearts.